Welcome to the B2B Growth Blueprint podcast, where we talk with entrepreneurs, founders, and leaders at B2B services, tech, and SaaS companies to learn the systems and processes they've used to create success for their business. We'll also learn from marketing and sales experts to provide insights to help you grow your business. I'm your host, Mark Osborne, and the podcast is brought to you by Modern Revenue Strategies and their 10x ROI B2B growth guarantee. Schedule a free diagnostic call to learn the fastest path to double your B2B revenues in just 90 days. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the B2B Growth Blueprint podcast. I am your host, Mark Osborne, and today I am very excited to welcome Dr. Richard Hagberg. Now, I'm going to read his bio to get it right because he has done a lot. Dr. Hagberg is a licensed psychologist. He's been an organizational consultant for over 40 years in Silicon Valley. And he's worked with some of the biggest names you can possibly imagine, from Twitter, Dropbox, Asana, Pinterest, Salesforce, Reddit, Instacart, Tinder, NerdWallet. He's worked with a lot. As both a practitioner and a researcher, Dr. Hagberg has built and gained a reputation as an expert on effective leadership and organizational culture. And in fact, he has a new book on this topic, which we're going to spend some time talking about. He's been a personal coach to over 600 company presidents and CEOs, and he's really an expert on the coaching process, especially there in Silicon Valley. He currently works with clients all over the world, and over his career, he's identified three different leadership styles: the visionary evangelist, the relationship builder, and the manager of execution. We're going to talk about how those work together with his latest research. And he's conducted some effective leadership or some research on effective and non-effective leadership, which we're going to talk about in his new book, Founders Keepers, due out late 2024. He's often quoted in business and general media, been featured in publications like Fortune Magazine, Forbes, Business Week, The Wall Street Journal, Inc., Entrepreneur, U.S. News and World Report. So I'm so excited to welcome you to the program today and to talk about different leadership styles and the research that you've done for your book. So welcome, Rich.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So tell us about this book, Founders Keepers. You said it's going to be coming out in late 2024. I think you've got some primary research that's feeding into this and some really interesting sort of findings. And tell us what you've learned.
Sure. What we took a look at was 122 founders, and we had who I'd worked with. I think about 118 of them I had worked with.
Okay.
And we had both financial outcome data as well as personality and 360 rating data. And what we were really looking at is there anything that differentiates those who are successful from those who are not? And the measure of success was called MOIC, which is multiple of invested capital. So for every dollar that investors put in, what do they get back? So the successful founders were those founders who had returned 10x to the shareholders.
Okay.
What we knew going.
What time frame is that? Is that all of them are kind of 10-year or more?
Yeah,
or
it's
year?
All since 2009.
Okay.
All right. And they're from all over the world. And what we knew from previous research on founders is that the success rate is ridiculously low. Something like only 56% of the companies are there, like 5 years after they start. And only 1 in 10,000 makes it to be a unicorn or $1 billion company.
Sure.
So the way we would describe it is it's a killing field.
Sure.
And to avoid a killing field, you need to really make some major modifications in your style and in the way you manage and lead. One of the things that we say is it's Darwin at work.
Okay.
And it's really a survival of the fittest game. So what we first of all did is we took a look at all 122. We said, all right, well, what are founders like when you compare them to other executives?
Yeah.
And so that's the first thing that we'll talk about.
Okay.
And then what we'll talk about is what are the things that differentiate the successful ones from the unsuccessful ones in terms of both their personality, but also their behavior, because there's some really dramatic differences.
Yeah.
So let's start by talking about the skills that make the difference in terms of how their raters rated them. And their raters are not only their employees, but their investors, their board members, and their various other business partners.
And so this is looking at the difference between founders versus other managers, or
Yeah,
the difference.
this is how founders differ from other executives in general. What makes them founders?
Yeah.
What makes a founder a founder?
Yeah.
The first thing is, not surprisingly, and these are in order, by the way,
Mhm.
they're very astute observers of what's going on externally, both in the world and the economy, in technology, business trends, marketplace, all that.
Kind
And
of
they're
pattern recognition.
pattern recognition,
Yeah.
pattern recognition, and they're very creative. In fact, their skills on creativity are ridiculously high. And so what they do is they turn the observations into insights that helps them create a product vision. And then, with the exception of the unsuccessful founders, all founders tend to be very adaptable. So they iterate their product ideas and they adjust their plan. If you don't adjust it, you're done.
So you raised something interesting there. So essentially all founders, both successful and unsuccessful, are different from their sort of non-founder,
Yeah.
managerial counterparts in this sort of observation and creativity piece. Whether they're successful or not, they all share that.
Yes, they all share that. They're also agents of change who challenge the status quo. I mean, what are you doing in a startup? But you're
Right.
challenging the
That's right.
status quo. And the other thing is that they're exceedingly confident. Now, sometimes that's just, bravado, and sometimes it may be not real underneath.
Right.
But what that leads them to do is be very, very good at taking risks and reassuring their followers and their investors with their self-confidence.
Sure.
Sometimes that risk is impulsive. One of the things that is characteristic of the unsuccessful ones is that they're impulsive, but the successful ones are not. The successful ones have a sense of urgency, but they're not impulsive.
Huh.
The next one is, from a social skills standpoint, they're really good storytellers. They can inspire employees, inspire investors, inspire people in general. But their social skills have limits. I mean, they're good salesmen. They're not particularly good when it comes to emotional intelligence and reading
Huh.
people and group dynamics.
Interesting.
Because a startup is really a killing field, and so few survive. It's when I said Darwin is at work, they tend to be resilient. Now, their coworkers see them as actually more resilient than their personality test will show,
Hmm.
because some of them hide the stress very well.
Right.
But one of the differentiators between successful and unsuccessful is the resilience. The successful ones are more resilient. They're able to handle the pressure. Um, Uh, all founders are intensely committed, hardworking, dedicated. Um, they'll hit the wall, they'll hit the wall, they'll hit the wall, they'll hit the wall again. And lastly, their last greatest strengths is that they take initiative. They're
Hmm.
willing to make decisions. Now, they don't always make good decisions. Sometimes their action orientation is a problem because,
Right.
they suffer a lot of the biases that everybody else suffers, like overconfidence bias and confirmation bias. Nobody wants to challenge the founder. So anyway, but their weaknesses are dramatic. And you talked about the three pillars of leadership before: the visionary evangelist, think Elon Musk and Steve
Yeah.
Jobs; the relationship builder, think, Schultz at Starbucks, or, the, 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 John Chambers at Cisco,
Yeah.
uh, Andrew Newey, Pepsi. Yeah, even Jamie Dimon is a relationship builder. But founders are at the best founders are a little bit above the mean on relationship builders. The unsuccessful founders are not good at relationship building, but all founders are terrible at managing execution.
Really?
Yeah, they confuse structure, systems, and process with bureaucracy rather than with efficiency. And as a company scales, that begins to get in the way.
That's really interesting. So you and I were talking a little bit before, and a lot of what we do is to help businesses, build in systems. And the book that I published last year talked about how the companies that are really succeeding are those that can, recognize the need for systems and then build systems that then layer in data and
Yep.
technology to sort of create that. It's interesting to hear you say that. Now, is this across the board a challenge
Yeah.
for
It's
founders?
across the board. It's a
Wow.
founder trait in general. Now, the one thing I would say is that, and this is important for founders to hear,
Yeah.
the successful founders take the initiative to scale up proactively the systems and processes that they need. The unsuccessful founders wait for things to break.
Hmm.
And so when a company is scaling fast, that becomes a real issue,
Yeah.
right?
So
So now let's talk about founders' weaknesses in general. The first thing is, although these people are visionaries, they're terrible when it comes to translating vision into short-term goals and metrics and milestones and clarifying rules.
that's systemizing the vision.
That's right. That's right. They're terrible at that. And their second worst skill is building systems and processes.
Huh.
But again, the successful ones are a little better at that,
Yeah.
and they're more proactive. The third thing is that although they're decisive, they don't make effective decisions. Um, the the problem here is that they have strong biases. They have strong opinions, and rather than let the facts win, they want to win and be right.
Interesting. Well,
And
it's so funny to hear you say that. And we'll get back. I just sort of can't help but call it out because oftentimes when we're building systems, we're trying to build a system that makes the right decision so that it doesn't rely on a particular individual because
yes,
individuals have bias.
that's
Whereas a
right.
system can be unbiased and just take in authentic data. So that's really interesting to hear.
Yep, yep. It's very, very true. So really the solution here
Uh-huh.
is that you need to put in place a disciplined decision process when it's a bet the company decision.
Yeah.
And you need to lead that process rather than dominate it. You need to be sure that the best ideas and the right facts get surfaced rather than, trying to win the argument and let your option be,
Right.
be the one that wins the day. I mean, you have to have a passion for facts and the passion for alternatives, and you need to create an environment where people are willing to challenge you and challenge your assumptions,
Yeah.
right? Um, the
Cool.
next thing is that founders tend to have a clear idea in their head about what they want,
Uh-huh.
but they don't really communicate that clearly in terms of expectations. So they're not good at holding people accountable. And they also are conflict avoiders, so they don't hold people accountable because they wait till they get frustrated and then they blow up.
Interesting.
In 1991, I got my first 360, and I was accused of drive-by delegation. And what that meant was that uh, I had a clear idea, and I would drive by fast and yell out the window and expect people to read my mind, and they didn't do a very good job of it. And then I'd get frustrated when they delivered something that wasn't what I wanted.
Sure.
And founders do this regularly. Um,
Interesting.
The next thing is, I think in general, you'd have to say founders are undisciplined.
Hmm.
And so one of their big weaknesses is that they're not dependable. They don't meet their commitments. And this frustrates the hell out of employees because it
Right.
says they don't really care about whatever the employees, maybe they didn't show up for a meeting or they canceled a one-on-one or whatever it was, but
Sure.
it's really a sign of insensitivity. Um, the next piece is they really don't provide good feedback to people. They don't provide praise. Most of them are critical rather than praising. They don't provide recognition, so you don't know what you're doing that's working and what
Right.
the person wants you to do. And they don't provide any coaching, so they just toss you in the deep end and say figure it out, right? And that doesn't generally work very well, right?
Sure.
um, Another one of the primary weaknesses is that when you're a founder, you're out raising money every couple of years, if not more often. You're trying to solve the problems of getting the product out the door or dealing with the customers who are frustrated, and you're fighting fires. And what happens is they get out of touch with what's going on in the organization. So their awareness of the organization is limited.
Hmm.
If they use surveys, like mini culture surveys or
Right.
various culture things or employee surveys, then they can stay in touch. But in general, they're out of touch. And that gets in the way because, for instance, conflicts develop.
Yeah.
And as the more you bring in senior people, the more you have egos that are going to conflict.
Right.
And often they're clueless about that, or they think they're big boys and girls, they should work it out themselves, right? Uh,
Interesting.
but they don't. Or else when it comes to conflict, they create conflicts, especially one of the main characteristics of the unsuccessful is that they're emotionally reactive, and that's intimidating to people. And so if there's a conflict between two other people, then they make it worse.
Huh. So
Um,
some of these things that you've laid out in terms of like some of the challenges that founders face and some of the ways to kind of mitigate them that sort of come to mind. So I don't know if you're familiar with like EOS, the entrepreneurial operating
yeah.
system, but they talk a lot about the idea of having like the visionary and the integrator within organizations, where the visionary is, I think, in a lot of ways kind of fits this psychological profile you've described as the founder of, that they've got this creativity and they've got this vision, the ability to see connections, but then they have a counterpart in the integrator, which is the person that can come in and create systems that remove bias from decision making, create systems that can ensure accountability and sort of feedback for the rest of the organization. I'm curious, though, how often do you see that maybe these integrators don't wind up really being founders by themselves as much as they wind up being part of a founding team?
Absolutely right. We would call that the visionary evangelist is the typical founder.
Uh-huh.
They need to bring in managers of execution, but they need those managers of execution to have at least average social skills, relationship skills, or else
Ah,
they break glass. They bring structure, but they break glass because managers of execution tend to be autocratic and top down. They're very organized, they're principle driven, all the rest of that, but they have a clear model in their head about the right way to do things. And
right.
if they don't have the flexibility, then they run into resistance. And the organization will see them as an impediment that the antibodies will attack them. Um,
I I'm going to make a little bit of a leap just from our conversation so far. So it seems like we need this visionary evangelist that can, be this, expert observationalist in the marketplace and see these connections,
yes.
and then have that resilience and sort of decision making. And then we need this manager of execution that can create the systems that allow us to be successful and remove bias. My guess is maybe we also need that relationship builder that can come in and sort of soften the edges of both of those other players.
Yeah, nobody is a pure type. I mean, the
Okay.
ideal COO or function head, depending upon what the function is,
Yeah.
would be at least medium on relationship, but high on execution.
Got it.
Um, so um, the other thing that gets in the way is that founders' highest personality score is need for autonomy.
Hmm.
And so they are very independent lone wolves. I have a blog on that on LinkedIn on the lone wolf. And so teams are foreign to them. They've often haven't been a member of a team. Sometimes the really good leaders were members of sports teams when they were growing up, where they learned about the synergy and how teams can work together and coordinate their efforts.
Hmm.
But most founders don't have that capacity. They tend to be loners. And so when it comes to making decision, they go off on the mountain, talk to God, and come down with the tablets. They don't utilize their team and facilitate a disciplined conversation and work through the team. And they don't empower the team. That's the other thing. These people are control freaks more often than not. And so they aren't gaining leverage. I mean, you gain leverage with systems and processes, but you gain leverage by working through other people.
That's right.
And so they need to learn to empower rather than try to control everything and micromanage, and many micromanage. Um, one of the real tests of a founder is how they handle resistance to change. Because when you're in a leadership role, all you're doing is bringing about change. And
Okay.
when you're in a fast changing startup, you're changing things all the time. And what got you here won't get you there.
That's right.
And so as the organization scales, you need to bring in some structure and process and discipline. And a lot of the early employees resist that. They like the informality of it when everybody was in one room and there were no policies and everybody wore multiple hats and nobody had limits on what they could do because they had a defined role. The leader who's going to be effective, the founder is going to be effective, needs to help people recognize that they need to change and adapt.
That-
And the sad fact is that probably most of your original founding team won't be there by the time you go public.
That's right. Well,
Um,
it's because it's almost different roles. So
it is.
I've actually seen some research that talks about, if you look at sort of the profile of a leader versus the profile of a manager, where a leader, sort of instigates change, creates this vision, finds these new connections. A manager optimizes processes, delivers against this set expectations, maintains performance. And so then if you map those two things against, sort of the life cycle of an organization, the sort of forming, storming, norming, and
Yep. Yep.
performing,
Yep.
you,
Yep.
you really need leaders at the early stage that can help you inspire bring people together to form and inspire to get through that storming stage and even to kind of establish what those norms are. But then you
Yes.
need that manager to manage it through that performing stage
Yeah.
in order to kind of deliver and actually, make sense. I've actually worked with companies myself where, founders are sort of so excited by new ideas and finding new connections, these observations in the marketplace, that as soon as like they've got an idea and it's starting to kind of perform against, they want to switch the whole organization to something else.
Yep. That's
And
true.
they need that sort of support structure to say, nope, we got to commit to this. This is what this quarter is about. It's about these incremental improvements in our processes and all those things.
You're absolutely right. They have to fight the shiny object
That's
tendency.
right.
They get defocused very easily. Um, you know, just a very simple digression, and that is that when we studied results in productivity, what we found was it boils down to both focus and prioritization, which are really overlapping concepts. And
Sure.
very few divergent thinking, creative founders are capable of that.
Hmm.
And so, the best COO I ever had, I would come up with a new idea And I'd come to her and she'd say, well, where's that fit in the strategic plan?
That's right.
And so she would bring me back to, to the priorities.
Well, but that assumes that you have that
Yeah.
strategic, which is in some ways part of the systems that some founders might see as bureaucracy of taking the time to define a strategic plan and a roadmap for executing against it.
When it comes to strategic planning, and by the way, the last third of the book, it's all advice chapters on each of the things that are the biggest problems for founders. Okay. But most founders don't plan systematically, and they start to do some kind of quote unquote strategic plan, but it's too infrequent, and it depends too much on their insights. You need to put in place a strategic planning process that is an ongoing dynamic thing that you're doing all the time. And because the market is moving fast, technology is moving fast, AI is dominating everybody these days, and everybody's is afraid, or they see it as an opportunity. So the strategic plan of 2 years ago has to be scrapped.
Yeah.
And so you can't just do it once a year like our fathers would do. It has to be a dynamic process that involves inputs from people who have all kinds of insights, whether they're technological or market insights or people insights. It's important. When I mentioned before resistance to change, the best way to deal with resistance is you've got to listen to the resistance to understand it. Maybe they've spotted something you haven't, something that will kill your initiative. But then you need to juxtapose why the status quo won't work anymore. And then what is your plan for moving ahead and addressing what the problem is with the status quo? So you have to juxtapose fear with vision, right? Yeah. The last thing is that founders aren't systematic or often lack the trust to share enough information with employees.
Interesting.
And so employees are often in the dark, especially if the founder is a loner. And so, you need to keep employees up to date with all the crazy changes that are happening. And there are usually a lot of them. In fact, one of the things that I would suggest is that founders need to understand what's called for and what's necessary when you're at the seed stage is going to change dramatically when you go into the traction stage.
That's right.
And change again when you go into the fast growth stage.
Yeah.
And what got you here in one stage isn't going to get you there in the next stage. It's just, and it's hard for them to see.
It's that classic crossing the chasm.
It's classic crossing the chasm, right? Yeah. And the founders who want to hold on to the way it was are just not going to make it, right? It was particularly true about culture, because the informal bro culture in the early days is not going to make it.
That's right. So interesting.
So now let's talk about successful versus unsuccessful.
Sure.
So remember, we got financial success metrics, multiples of invested capital, and we looked at, the founders who were successful and the founders who were not. There are some key differentiating factors. I'll give you the overview, then I'll go into each one. The first one is adaptability. If you're not willing to iterate and listen to input and change your way of doing things, you're not going to survive. One of the things that I've realized, and actually Teen Zuo, my co-author, said this. He said, what got you here won't get you there. And so you've got to be willing to iterate, because the reality is, if you look at it over the long term, you never have product market fit that's permanent.
That's right.
As you grow, you'll have to adapt. And so this is
Cheese is
Darwin.
always moving, as they say.
This is Darwin. So those who don't adapt and the unsuccessful don't adapt. The next thing, and I'll go into these in more depth, but the next thing is they got to learn to work through others. The successful ones learn to work through others. They give up control and they utilize their team. They work through their team. They benefit from the team's problem solving. They make better decisions.
Yeah.
The third one is discipline scaling. And that's where you got to have the managers of execution. And the reality is most founders are not going to be able to make the transition to being the discipline manager of execution. It's not in them.
That's right. They need another person to play that
role. They need multiple other. Ideally, you have a manager of execution in at least 4 of the functions, right?
Right.
The next thing is what we call personal grounding. And that's things like control and the ability to handle stress, but it's also integrity. And the last thing is self-awareness. Those founders who are more aware of their weaknesses are more likely to be able to make the adaptations that are going to be required. So, making sense so far?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So now let's talk about the adaptability. Essentially, what it is it's a kind of a learning, iterative mindset. You have to be continuously learning and be curious rather than lock on to a model of the way it ought to be. You have to listen and you have to adapt. You have to learn. You have to be a learner. And you have to take feedback and not suppress it. You have to ask for it proactively. And when you meet resistance, you have to adapt. You have to listen, you have to adapt, you have to persuade, but it's not about you bulldozing.
Right.
Or powering through, as they say.
You can't talk your way out of it. You have to accept to the new reality.
And adaptability all rolls up to you need to learn to get buy-in, rather than mandating. So that's the adaptability factor. There are personality measures that actually will tell you whether somebody is going to be able to adapt. Optimists are more likely to adapt than pessimists. They see change as an opportunity.
Right.
You have to be comfortable with ambiguity. If people aren't comfortable with ambiguity, if they want to have certainty before they do anything, or when things get uncertain, they get anxious, then they're going to have a problem with an organization that needs to adapt. If they're stubborn and they're headstrong, and a lot of founders are, then they have to learn to let go of their existing ideas.
Yeah.
So I think all founders are headstrong.
Right.
But the ones who've learned to be more diplomatic and who are more socially savvy, they adapt.
Yeah.
A big piece of adaptability is your willingness to trust people.
Yeah.
Because it's a kind of a leap of faith often, and if you don't trust people, then you're going to think of all the things that will go wrong, and you'll hold on to the old idea.
That's right. That pessimism.
Yeah, and you have to ask for the opinions of others. If you're proudly self-reliant, as many founders are, then you're going to miss key inputs that may save your ass.
Yeah.
So, and the last piece of being adaptable is being a little bit purposeful and careful in your thinking rather than being impulsive. Right? So that's adaptability. Working through others, the key is delegation and empowerment. Now, just delegating isn't enough. Empowerment involves slowly transferring power to others and letting them have decision-making authority. you can delegate tasks but not empower. But as your company grows and you bring in senior people, you're going to need you're going to need to empower them because they won't accept it when you don't.
Well, and that's one of the things that we see when building systems for folks oftentimes is just because you've described a process, and even if you've put someone else's name on that process, if you haven't empowered them to actually move it through, you don't really have a system in place. You've just got a playbook, but you still own all the decision making. That's not an independent system.
And you become a roadblock to decision.
That's right.
They all have to go through you. The third part of working through others is building teams. You have to know how to build teams. You have to get past your loner tendencies. But often the team that got you where you are may not have the talent you need. I mean, people get over their head. And just because they were your roommate or your buddy and your co-founder, that doesn't mean that they're still able to do the job when the company starts to scale up in the traction stage. So, I mean, just because you appointed Fred as your VP of sales because he was the most extroverted and he's most willing to talk to people, that doesn't mean he knows anything about sales systems and processes.
Right.
So if finding and attracting talent and then utilizing the talent is really a key to working through others.
Yeah.
And the last thing, which really doesn't come natural to a lot of these loner introverts, is you gotta build connection and build relationships with people. And a lot of founders don't have the interpersonal skills beyond storytelling.
Interesting.
Okay, so now let's talk about discipline scaling.
Sure.
It's really intriguing. You know, the people who are better at this are people who are a little more structured for sure. And founders in general are not good at structure. They don't like it. But what we found was that the successful founders take initiative proactively to put in place systems and processes to address inefficiency. It's about efficiency. It's not about bureaucracy, Mr. Founder or Ms. Founder. Right. And they don't get that. And then they got to stay focused. And focus is not something that the typical entrepreneurial founder does very well. You got to communicate priorities. You got to set clear expectations. And you have to hold people accountable. That's all part of discipline scaling. Yeah. Now, I have some material. I have a deck that's called Creating a Culture of Discipline. And most founders are just not very good at that. Yeah. We talked about personal grounding before. Yeah. The successful founders maintain their composure better than the ones who are unsuccessful. They handle the stress. They don't make emotional decisions. They have better judgment, but they also have better integrity. They're not ego-driven. They're principle-driven. They don't just think of themselves. I mean, we have a very long section in the book on narcissism.
Oh yeah.
And the majority of founders are narcissistic to some degree, but when that narcissism becomes toxic narcissism, it starts destroying trust of employees and investors and partners and customers. So when you start stretching the truth because you didn't hit your numbers,
right,
or inflating the number of users or whatever it is. I mean, we can look at Samuel Bankman-Fried and
sure.
Some of the other ones who were just, I mean, Elizabeth Holmes is classic.
Sure.
So it turns out that the more effective founders they look more like servant leaders.
Interesting.
A servant leader is focused on, enabling the organization and being a servant of the organization rather than their own personal self-interest.
Wow.
So, and then the last thing is self-awareness.
Yeah.
Because one of the more interesting conclusions in the book is that there's an item in the personality test that says, I frequently think about my past successes and failures. And the successful ones answer strongly yes to that.
Huh.
And the unsuccessful, no, because the
Don't take the time to
successful
reflect.
want to learn, they want to get better. They want to be aware of where their autopilot gets in the way. Right? And so they acknowledge their weaknesses. They understand the impact of their behavior rather than being oblivious to the fact that they were just incredibly insensitive to an employee in a
Right.
hands meeting, right?
Right.
Or the way they handled a termination was just really insensitive. Or the fact that they gave themselves some kind of perk when the
Right.
company was struggling to make it financially. Founders in
Interesting.
general don't like boundaries,
Uh-huh.
but the successful ones recognize that there are certain boundaries that they can't step over. They have a better moral compass, is another way of saying it.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Rich, so much great stuff here. We could talk about this for hours, but I got to be respectful of your time. Founders Keepers is the name of the book. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
Be coming out late 2024. Lots of great, rich content that you've shared with us today, and I'm sure those in our audience that are founders themselves or working with founders and companies will have gleaned a lot from this. For those of our audience that sort of heard of some of what you had to say and want to learn more, how can they get in touch with you?
Well, the first thing they can do is go to hagbergconsulting.com.
Okay.
That's one way. Or my email address is rahagberg, rahagberg @gmail.com. But either way, they
Fantastic.
can get me.
Well, congratulations again on the book. Some awesome research that went into fueling that. Obviously, you've got a wealth of information from all of your experience working in Silicon Valley over the years. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining this episode of the B2B Growth Blueprint podcast. We hope you've gained insights to grow your business. If you enjoyed this discussion, please rate, comment, like on your favorite platform, and share to others who will find it useful. Do you know a CEO, founder, or leader at an early stage B2B services, tech, or SaaS company who would like to be a guest and share their story? Send us a note. Let's schedule a conversation.